There is something no one tells you about being the most powerful man in the room. You will never know who is telling you the truth. Never. 20 men sit around your table, nodding at every word you say, raising their glasses to every decision you make, and you know, with absolute certainty, that at least half of them are quietly calculating when to take everything you have. Reed Kincaid lived like that for 8 years. 8 years at the head of the table. 8 years reading every face and trusting none. But in all those 8 years, exactly one person looked him straight in the eye and said exactly what she thought. No games, no calculations, no fear. Not because she was brave, but because she had never learned to be afraid the way everyone around him had learned long ago. She was the cook in his estate. Her name was Nina. And tonight, while he was signing a marriage alliance with the daughter of the Davenport family in front of 20 of Chicago's most powerful men, she was 3 floors below, setting a bottle of wine back on a shelf very gently, pulling a backpack she always kept hidden under the kitchen cabinet, and walking out of his life without a sound. If this story touched you, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. And if you want to follow the next stories, subscribe to our channel, because the best stories always need someone who stays until the end. Nina felt it before she could name it. She was in the wine cellar, the deepest place in Kincaid Manor, where the lights were always a pale gold and the air stayed cool no matter the season. This was where she usually came alone when the manor grew too loud, too full of voices, too full of the footsteps of men moving back and forth as though the floors belonged to them. The wine cellar belonged to no one, and because of that, it belonged to her. She was taking inventory of several bottles for next week's gathering, a small notebook in her hand, her eyes moving over the labels, her mind trying to keep itself occupied. For the past 3 weeks, she had kept telling herself that tonight had nothing to do with her, that the ceremony upstairs was only politics, that whatever she and Reed had shared in the late hours of the night had nothing to do with the name Carolyn Davenport, with the agreement, with the 20 men seated around the oak table calling it the future of the family. She had told herself those things enough times that she had almost believed them. Almost. Then everything went out. Not pain, not the sound of anything breaking or collapsing, just absence. Like when you're listening to a song so familiar you don't even realize you're hearing it anymore, and then all at once it stops in the middle, and the silence after it is louder than any sound. That was what Nina felt. An absence. Something that had always been there, warm and steady, as a second breath running alongside her own, suddenly vanished. She didn't hear applause from upstairs. She didn't hear glasses touching, but she knew. She knew in the way she had always known things. Not through words, not through proof, but through something deeper. Something she had never been able to explain and had never tried to explain. Nina stood perfectly still for exactly 10 seconds. She counted each beat, a slow, hollow rhythm against the heavy silence of the cellar. 1, 2, 3. Her fingers gripped the wine bottle, cold and unyielding. 4, 5, 6. The label blurred before her eyes, the gold foil losing its luster. 7, 8. She set the bottle back on the shelf with a surgeon's precision so gently that not a single drop trembled inside the glass. By the count of 10, the Nina who had belonged to Kincaid Manor was gone. She moved through the shadows of the back corridor like a ghost, entering the kitchen for the final time. She didn't look at the table where she had shared midnight secrets, nor did she touch the apron hanging behind the door. That was a uniform for a life she was now shedding. Reaching beneath the cabinet, she pulled out the worn backpack she'd kept hidden for 2 years, the only thing that truly belonged to her. She stepped out the back door without a sound. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury for those who had a safe place to land, and Nina had none. In the rear lot, her old car sputtered to life. She drove out via the service road, turning off her GPS and ignoring her payroll card. She knew the Kincaid machinery too well. Every digital footprint was a trap. With only a roll of cash tucked into a zip bag at the bottom of her pack, she headed north. She didn't look back at the lights of the manor, because for the first time in 14 months, she was truly invisible again. 3 floors above her, in the large room covered in black carpet, Reed Kincaid was standing among 20 captains. The pen was still in his hand. The glass of wine someone had just placed before him still hadn't been touched. All around him, people were talking, shaking hands, nodding to one another in the way of men who had just completed an agreement and wanted to make certain everyone else knew they were satisfied. But Reed heard none of it. He was trying to identify something he couldn't name. The room was still full of people. No one had left, but something had just changed. as though someone had extinguished a light he hadn't known was burning until it went dark. 14 months before the night everything fell apart, Nina Blake didn't know who Reed Kincaid was. That is, she knew his name. Everyone in the manor did. She knew he was the head of the Kincaid family, knew that when he walked into a room every conversation changed its rhythm, knew that men twice her size lowered their voices when they spoke his name, but she had never spoken to him directly. She was the cook. He was the man her food was served to. Between those two positions was a distance no one in this manor ever thought of crossing. Until one night in March, at 1 o'clock in the morning, when Jonas Heath stopped at the kitchen door and told her the boss hadn't eaten all day, that the meeting had ended long ago, but he was still in his study, and that she should bring a tray upstairs to the 3rd floor. Jonas didn't explain anything more. He never explained anything more. He said exactly what needed to be said, not one word beyond it, then walked away as though the story had ended before it began. Nina prepared a simple tray. She didn't know what Reed liked to eat at 1 o'clock in the morning, but she did know that someone who hadn't eaten all day didn't need a feast. They needed something warm that demanded nothing from them. She made a bowl of chicken porridge, added toast, and a glass of water. Simple. She carried the tray to the 3rd floor. The hallway was dark and quiet in the way. Places of power were often quiet at night. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of everything waiting. She knocked on the study door. No one answered. She waited, knocked again. Still silence. She pushed the door open. The room was dark. No lights were on. Only the glow from the large window across from her, the streetlights outside casting in just enough light for her to make out the shape of a man sitting behind the desk, his face turned toward the glass, not looking at her, not looking at anything at all in the way of someone who is staring but doesn't truly see. Nina set the tray on the desk. She meant to turn and leave. She had taken barely half a step when she heard his voice. Wait. It wasn't a command. It wasn't the voice of a man used to being obeyed. It was the voice of someone who had sat too long in the dark and needed to hear a sound other than his own thoughts. Nina stopped. "Were you afraid to walk into this room?" he asked, still not turning around, still looking out the window. Nina thought for about 2 seconds. "No," she said. "I was only afraid the food would get cold." Silence. Then a sound from the desk, not quite laughter, but the closest thing to laughter Reed Kincaid had made in many years. She didn't know that then. She would know later. That night, Nina left the room after Reed finished the entire bowl of porridge without saying another word. She thought it would be the only time. But the next night, Jonas stopped again at the kitchen door. Same request, same clipped voice. The boss hadn't eaten. Bring it to the 3rd floor. And the night after that, and the night after that. After about 2 weeks, Nina realized Jonas didn't even need to come down to the kitchen and tell her anymore, because she had already begun preparing a tray at midnight as a habit. And after about a month, Reed stopped waiting for her to bring it upstairs. He came down to the kitchen. No warning, no explanation. He simply appeared at the kitchen door sometime after midnight, pulled out a chair at the corner of the table, and talked to her while she cleaned up or prepared things for the next day. They talked about small things, the weather, a book she was reading, an old film they both happened to like, then about larger things. He told her about his father, the man who had built the Kincaid family into an empire and died without leaving his son a single real relationship beyond power. She listened without offering empty comfort. Only silence and now and then a short, direct sentence placed exactly where it belonged. The kind of sentence no one around him would dare say because they were too busy calculating which words might benefit them. The kitchen became the only place in the manor where Reed allowed himself not to be the boss. There was the smell of food instead of the smell of leather and ambition. There was warm yellow light instead of the white light of the meeting room. There was Nina, who looked at him and saw a tired man instead of a name people either feared or wanted to use. 6 months after the night of that bowl of chicken porridge, Nina was teaching Reed how to slice onions at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was one of those nights when he came down to the kitchen later than usual, his eyes carrying that familiar look of a man who had spent too long in his study with too many numbers and too few answers. She didn't ask what was wrong. She had learned very early that Reed wasn't the kind of man you asked, "Are you all right?" and expected a real answer from. He was the kind of man who would speak when he was ready, and if you were patient enough not to ask, he would say more than you ever expected. That night, he didn't want to talk. He wanted to do something with his hands. So when Nina began preparing ingredients for the next day, He pulled a chair closer to the kitchen counter and said, "Teach me." Nina looked at him as though he had just said something in a foreign language. Then she handed him a knife and an onion and said, "Keep your hand steady. Cut from the top down. Don't press. Let the knife do the work." Reed Kincaid, the man before whom 20 captains weighed every word in meetings before speaking, was standing in the kitchen at 3 a.m, holding a knife and cutting an onion like a student in his first cooking class. He did it wrong. Of course he did it wrong. He pressed too hard. The blade slipped, and half the onion shot off the board, rolled across the kitchen floor, and came to rest at the foot of the spice cabinet. Both of them bent down to pick it up. And that was when everything changed. Not in the way it happens in films, with music swelling, with light falling at just the right angle, with someone speaking a line full of grand meaning. It was only 2 people bending down to pick up half an onion from a kitchen floor, their heads nearly touching, and when they both lifted their faces at the same time, their eyes were less than a handspan apart. Nina saw his eyes from a distance she had never seen them before, and in those eyes there was no power, no calculation, none of the coldness everyone in the manor had grown used to. There was only exhaustion, and something else, something softer, farther away, something he had hidden too carefully and for too long, so long that perhaps even he had forgotten he was hiding it. She didn't know how long she looked at him. Maybe 2 seconds, maybe longer, but when they both stood upright again, with half the onion still lying on the floor and neither of them picking it up and neither of them saying a word, she knew, and he knew too, that this thing, whatever it was, had crossed a line they both knew should never be crossed. They didn't kiss that night. They didn't touch. Reed set the knife down on the counter, sat back in the chair, and stayed silent for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice low and slow, as though he was speaking more to himself than to her. "For 8 years now, everyone who talks to me wants something. A position, a privilege, a guarantee. They laugh at the right moment, nod in the right place, and I've never known which of it was real." He looked at her. "You're the only person in 8 years who's talked to me without wanting anything at all." Nina leaned back against the counter. She stayed silent for a moment too. Then she told him, not because he asked, but because for the first time in a very long while, she felt that someone would listen without looking at her with pity. She told him she had grown up in foster care, that when she was little, she had lived with different families, and none of them had lasted long. No one ever explained the reason clearly. She only knew that every time she was moved, the adults looked at her with an expression she couldn't understand. Not hatred, but a kind of unease they couldn't name. The day she turned 18, she left. No plan, no destination. She simply kept going north, day after day, until there was no road left. "How did you know to come here?" Reed asked. "I didn't," Nina said. "I just stopped when someone gave me work. Ruth McAllister, the head housekeeper. Was that someone?" The woman who had looked at an 18-year-old girl standing at the manor gate with a backpack and the eyes of someone who had nowhere to return to, and said, "Kitchen, tomorrow morning. Don't be late." Nina had never been late a single day in more than 2 years, and she had never told anyone about Reed either, about the nights in the kitchen, about the way he laughed when no one was watching, about the way he said her name, not like a name, but like a place he wanted to stay. What existed between them had no name, because it wasn't allowed to exist. A cook with no family standing and the boss of the most powerful crime family in Chicago. The Council of Captains, the allied families, the delicate political machinery Reed had to keep balanced every day. Not one of them would ever accept this. Reed knew it. Nina knew it too. "I'll find a way," he told her one late night, his voice calm in the way it always was when he was promising something he truly meant to keep. "I need time, but I'll find a way." Nina believed him. 6 weeks before the night of the signing ceremony, Marshall Pruitt walked into Reed's study without knocking. It was his habit. 28 years of serving the Kincaid family had given him that privilege, or at least he believed it had, and Reed had never corrected him because until that moment, he had never had a reason to. Marshall was the one who had kept everything from collapsing when Reed's father died suddenly and left an empire to a 25-year-old man with no allies, only enemies and a chair everyone wanted to take. Marshall had taught Reed how to read a room, how to keep his voice steady while everything inside was burning, how to turn silence into a weapon stronger than any threat. 8 years. Reed had trusted him for 8 years, and because of that, when Marshall sat down in the chair across from the desk that evening, and began in a voice so calm it was almost gentle. Reed listened. "I know about the cook," Marshall said. No circling, no pretense. He said it the way a man reads a test result, precise, without emotion, as though this information were a number on a spreadsheet, rather than a bomb placed in the middle of the table. Reed didn't react. He had learned not to react a long time ago, but inside his chest, something tightened. "I don't care about your personal life," Marshall continued. "I never have. But there are things the council will care about. A cook with no family standing, no background, no political value, in a close relationship with the head of the family. How do you think 15 captains sitting in that room will view this?" Reed was silent. Marshall was silent too. He was good at that, knowing when to let silence do the work words didn't need to do. Then he placed a sheet of paper on the desk, a list of names, captains whom, according to Marshall, were ready to support a formal accusation if Reed didn't act. An accusation that Nina Blake had used her position as a cook to gain access to and influence the head of the family, that she was a threat to stability, that she needed to be removed from the manor, and, if necessary, from Chicago. Reed looked at the list. The names Marshall had written weren't the names of weak men. They were men with enough weight to turn a threat into action. And Reed, whether he wanted to admit it or not, knew that in this world, an accusation didn't have to be true to cause damage. It only had to exist long enough. "The Davenport family has proposed an alliance," Marshall said, his voice still even as though reading a quarterly report. "Carolyn Davenport, the eldest daughter, a political marriage, a union between the two largest families in the Great Lakes region. This is the best solution for the family, and also the only way to ensure that your cook isn't brought before the council." He paused. "You have 3 days." Reed wanted to say no. He wanted to stand, look Marshall in the eye, and say that he had no right to decide this. But that is the nature of traps built by someone who understands you. Marshall didn't use power to force Reed. He used Reed's fear, the fear that Nina, who had no family to protect her, no name to shield her, nothing but herself, would be crushed by the machine Reed stood at the head of, but did not fully control. Marshall knew exactly where Reed was most vulnerable, and he set the trap there. Reed didn't tell Nina. He didn't go down to the kitchen that night. Not the next night either. On the 3rd night, he sat alone in his study, looking at the sheet of names, and made the decision he believed would protect the woman he loved. He agreed to sign the agreement with the Davenport family. He chose silence over truth. He thought that if Nina didn't know, she wouldn't be hurt. That distance and ignorance would be a kind of armor he could place around her from afar, that he could keep both things at once, her safety and his secret, without either of them breaking. He was wrong. On the morning of the signing ceremony, at 7:15, Nina's phone vibrated once. A message from Reed's number. She was in the kitchen, preparing ingredients for the evening party as she did every day, flour still clinging to her hands, and she had to wipe them on her apron before picking up the phone. The screen lit up. One line. "You should leave the manor before tonight. It'll be easier for both of us." Nina read that line twice. The first time, her eyes moved over the words so quickly that her mind hadn't yet caught up. The second time, she read it slowly, one word at a time, as though she were translating a language she had once known well and had suddenly forgotten. "It'll be easier for both of us." She didn't reply. There was nothing to reply to. That sentence had already said everything that needed saying and everything that didn't. It said that he had decided. It said that she was the part being cut away. It said that 14 months of late nights in the kitchen, 14 months of conversations she had believed were real, 14 months in which she had allowed herself to believe in something she had sworn never to believe in again, could all be folded into a single text sent at 7 in the morning, without even enough courage to say it to her face. Nina set the phone down. She stood still for about 10 seconds, her eyes fixed on the empty space above the sink. Then, she untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the kitchen counter. She didn't know that message hadn't been sent by Reed. She didn't know that Tessa Pruitt, Marshall's 24-year-old daughter, had taken Reed's number from the family's internal communication system and typed that message on her father's orders at 6:50 that morning. She knew none of that. She only knew that the man she had trusted had just told her to disappear, and she had heard words like that enough times in her life to know that when someone tells you to leave, you leave. The rest of what happened that day had already happened in the earlier part of the story. The backpack beneath the cabinet, the back door, the old car, northbound, No looking back. But there was one detail Nina told no one, and wouldn't tell for a very long time. Before leaving her room, she stopped at the bed. 3 weeks earlier, Reed had placed a handkerchief on her pillow. Folded inside it was a small note in his handwriting. She had read that note every night before sleep for 3 weeks, and each time she had put it away with care, as though it were the most fragile thing she had ever touched. That morning, when she slung the backpack onto her shoulder and prepared to walk out, her hand reached for the handkerchief on the pillow. She didn't know why she took it. She was angry enough to leave everything behind, but her hand still reached for it, in the way someone sinking in cold water still clings to anything that floats, even while trying to convince herself she doesn't need saving. She slipped the handkerchief into her coat pocket and left. After the signing ceremony, while the 20 captains were still downstairs shaking hands and raising glasses, Reed went up to the 3rd floor, not the 3rd floor where his study was, the back corridor leading to the staff quarters. He pushed open the door to Nina's room. Empty. The bed neatly made, the shelves clean. The folded apron on the small counter in the corner was the only sign that someone had once lived there. And on the pillow, where 3 weeks earlier he had placed the handkerchief with the handwritten note inside, there was nothing. She had taken it with her. Everything else she had left behind. Her work clothes were still folded in the drawer. Her spare shoes were still beneath the bed, but the handkerchief had gone with her. Reed stood in that doorway for a very long time. Downstairs, the manor was still celebrating. Music drifted upward through the wooden floors, threaded with laughter and the sound of glasses touching, the sounds of people satisfied with an agreement they believed was a victory. And Reed stood here, looking at an empty pillow, and understood something he wished he had understood 6 weeks earlier. She hadn't left because she hated him. Hate doesn't make you carry away the thing that hurts you. Hate throws the handkerchief in the trash and walks away light. She had taken it because she still held on, still needed it, still couldn't let go, even while running from the man who had given it to her. She had left because she believed he had looked at her and seen a problem that needed to be solved before the party began. Reed turned, walked straight to Marshall's room in the east wing of the manor. The older man was seated behind his desk, a cup of tea in front of him, wearing the expression of someone who had expected this meeting and had prepared for it. "Where is she?" Reed said from the doorway. Marshall set the tea down without hurry. "She made her choice. It seems she understood the situation more clearly than you thought. I didn't ask what she chose. I asked where she is. I don't know. And frankly, this is what's best for the family, for the Davenport agreement, and for her." Reed looked at Marshall, looked at him for a long time. He didn't shout. He didn't strike the desk. He didn't raise his voice even half a step. And that was the most frightening thing about Reed Kincaid. He was at his quietest when he was farthest from calm. "If I find out you had anything to do with her leaving," Reed said, his voice level and low like water before a storm, "the next conversation we have won't look anything like this one." He turned and walked away. Marshall remained seated with his tea gone cold, his face unchanged, his hands steady. But in his eyes, if anyone had looked closely enough, there was something that looked like calculation beginning all over again. Nina drove north through that entire night and the day that followed. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't listen to music. She didn't open the window. There was only the sound of the engine and the highway, and the darkness between the streetlights stretching out like the ticking of something slowly running out. She left Chicago at dusk, and by the time the sun rose again, she was already in Wisconsin. She kept going, not because she had a destination, but because stopping meant sitting still, and sitting still meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and she wasn't ready for that. The car ran out of gas in the afternoon of the second day, on a deserted forest road in northern Michigan, where the trees on both sides grew so tall they blocked out the sky, and the light filtered through the leaves in broken fragments instead of anything resembling sunlight. The fuel gauge had been blinking for more than 20 minutes, but she hadn't stopped at the last gas station she passed because it had cameras, and she didn't want to leave a trace. The habit of someone who had lived long enough in the world of the Kincaid family to know that cash doesn't leave marks. Bank cards do, and cameras always have someone watching later. She pulled over to the side of the road, turned off the engine, sat in the car for a few minutes longer, both hands still on the steering wheel, staring through the dust-streaked windshield. Then she took her backpack, locked the car, and walked into the forest. The next 2 days passed in the way time passes when you have no schedule, no phone, and no reason to distinguish morning from afternoon except for the shifting light above the canopy. Nina moved. That was what she did best. Move. Put one foot in front of the other, and don't look back. She found a trail that led toward Lake Michigan. She ate the small amount of dry food she had bought at the last gas station before entering Michigan. She slept in short stretches beneath a large tree, her back against the trunk, sleeping in that half-awake state of someone who has never truly slept deeply anywhere, because she has never trusted that wherever she lay was safe. The second night, 3 o'clock in the morning, Nina sat on the shore of Lake Michigan, her feet touching the water. The water was so cold she could feel each toe going numb, but she didn't pull her feet back. The cold was the only thing she could feel clearly right now, and she needed to feel something, anything, because everything else inside her was empty. Not pain. Pain she knew how to endure. She had endured pain her entire life, and pain at least had shape, had weight, could be held up and examined and named as the thing that made it hard to breathe. What she was feeling now wasn't pain, it was emptiness. The kind of emptiness that comes from someone who has been left behind so many times that she is no longer surprised by it. How many families? How many years without a home? How many times standing at a doorway with a bag on her shoulder watching an adult avoid her eyes because they didn't know how to explain why she couldn't stay? And now, the last person she had allowed herself to trust, the only person in 14 months who had made her think that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. That person had sent a message at 7 in the morning telling her to disappear before the party. The lake was dark and flat and wide enough that Nina felt small. Not small in the poetic way people like to describe when they stand before nature. Small in the real way, in the way of someone looking out over water with no visible far shore, and realizing that if she disappeared right now, no one in the world would notice she was gone. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket, touched the handkerchief. She gripped it, pulled it out, unfolded it carefully. The note inside was still there, the handwriting slightly smudged at the right corner because she had handled it so many times. She read it. When everything feels too heavy, remember that you are not alone. She hated that sentence. She hated it in this moment. Hated it with everything that was left in the hollow space inside her chest. Hated it because it had once made her believe, because she had read it every night before sleep, and each time it had made her feel a little warmer, a little safer, a little less alone. And now that sentence was only proof that she had been wrong, that she had let a small piece of paper and a voice in a kitchen at midnight convince her that there was a place in this world for her, when there wasn't. She folded the note again, slipped it back into the handkerchief, put it in her pocket. She didn't throw it away. She hated it, but she didn't throw it away. She didn't know why. Maybe habit. Maybe because it was the last thing left of something that had once been real. And even if it wasn't real anymore, she still couldn't let it go, like someone keeping the key to a house that has already been sold, not because they will return, but because their hand hasn't learned how to live with an empty pocket. Nina sat on the shore of the lake. 3 in the morning, cold water, darkness, and she cried. For the first time in her life, she cried without hiding. Not because she allowed herself to cry, but because there was no one to hide from. On the morning of the third day, Nina was walking along the edge of a shallow stream when she heard footsteps. Not the footsteps of someone moving through the woods in the ordinary way. People who move through the woods ordinarily try to stay quiet, avoiding dry branches, avoiding dead leaves, guided by the instinct of someone who doesn't want to be noticed. These footsteps were different, deliberate, heavy and even and slow, the kind of stride that wanted her to know someone was coming, wanted her to hear, wanted her to be afraid before she saw. Nina stopped. She counted. 1 set of footsteps ahead, slightly to the left, 1 set behind her, farther away, and another, closer, from the opposite bank of the stream. 3 men. They stepped out almost at the same time, not by accident, but in the way of men who had done this many times and knew exactly how to set the formation. 3 men. Strangers who operated in the region, the kind who existed in forests far from town for reasons ordinary people didn't want to know. The one in front was half a head taller than the other 2, broad-shouldered, walking with the slow ease of a man who had never hurried because he had never needed to. He looked at Nina and smiled. There was no warmth in it, the kind of smile she had seen enough times in her life to know it wasn't a greeting, it was a declaration. And what came after it was usually not something you wanted to stay and witness. "Lost, sweetheart?" he said, drawing out the last word as though the question were only the shell and something else entirely lay inside it. Nina didn't run. She wanted to. Everything in her body was screaming that she should turn and run. But she didn't. not because of courage. Nina had never confused courage with instinct. She stood still because she had lived long enough and had been in enough unsafe places to know one very simple thing. Running turns you into prey. Standing still at least leaves you an unknown, and an unknown is always more dangerous than prey in the eyes of a hunter. She stood straight, looked directly into the leader's eyes, said nothing. The other two men began to move, splitting to either side, narrowing the distance in the practiced way of men who had rehearsed this before, and Nina understood with a cold clarity that she had about 30 seconds before this situation moved beyond anything she could control. The gunshot cracked from the eastern edge of the woods, a single shot, sharp and solid, echoing through the trees and rebounding off the surface of the stream, loudly enough to send every bird within 100 yards into the air at once. The three men froze. Nina froze too, but her eyes had already turned toward the sound. A man stepped out from the trees, tall, lean, white-haired, about 70 years old, yet moving with the precision of someone who had used his body as a tool for many decades. He held a hunting rifle with absolute calm, the kind of hold of a man who had carried one so long it had become a natural extension of his arm. The barrel pointed toward the sky. He wasn't aiming at anyone. He didn't need to aim at anyone. He looked at the three men standing in front of Nina and said one sentence. Only one. His voice was even, not raised, not threatening, the voice of a man stating information rather than giving an order. But it was the kind of voice that two of the three men recognized immediately. The kind of voice that had once spoken at tables they would never have had the standing to enter. The kind of voice you hear only once in your life, and that one time is enough to teach you there are people in this world you don't test. The leader stood still for about 5 seconds, his eyes on the white-haired man, then back on Nina, then back on him. That second look lasted longer than the first. Then he nodded once, the smallest nod, the kind given by a man calculating very fast, and arriving at the conclusion that the prize wasn't worth the cost. He turned away. The other two followed. Within 30 seconds, the forest was quiet again, as though nothing had happened. The white-haired man lowered the barrel, rested it on his shoulder, and looked at Nina. "You've come a long way from anywhere safe," he said. His voice was calm, not judgmental, as though he were commenting on the weather. "I know," Nina said, and she was surprised her voice didn't shake. He looked at her a moment longer. In his eyes there was something Nina couldn't read at first. Not pity, not curiosity, but something like recognition, as though he were looking at something he had searched for a very long time, or had once seen in someone else many years ago. "I'm Walt Grayson," he said. "I live about 20 minutes from here on foot. You need a proper meal and sleep under a roof." He didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she had come from, didn't ask why she was alone in the middle of the woods. He only turned and started walking, with the easy certainty of a man who believed that if she was smart enough not to run when faced with 3 strangers, then she was smart enough to follow the man who had just saved her. Nina followed. Walt's house was small, set by the lake. The kind of house people build when they don't need to impress anyone, and only need a place to exist without being touched by the outside world. He fed her. Hot porridge, bread, clean water from a filter pitcher. He said nothing through the entire meal, only sat across from her with his tea and waited, with the patience of someone who had lived long enough to know that important conversations should never begin while a person is hungry. When Nina finished eating, he cleared the dishes and said, his voice still as even as it had been in the woods, "Sleep. There's a small room in the back. Questions can wait until tomorrow." The next morning, Nina woke to the smell of hot tea and the soft crackle of wood burning in the stove. She lay still for a few seconds, looking at the low wooden ceiling, trying to remember where she was. Then everything came back. The manor, the message, the lakeshore, the 3 strangers, the white-haired man. She sat up, and when she stepped into the front room, Walt was already seated at the table with his cup of tea, calm as though he had been sitting there his whole life, and would go on sitting there no matter who came out of the room and back. He placed a cup of tea in front of her without asking whether she wanted one. Then he sat in silence. Nina drank her tea. He drank his. The silence lasted, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence between 2 people who both knew the conversation would come when it needed to come, and neither of them was in a hurry. At last, Walt set down his cup, looked at her, and spoke. "I once knew someone who had eyes like yours." Nina looked at him. "Not the color," he said. "The way they look, as if they're reading something behind the words." behind the smile, behind the handshake. Most people look at the face in front of them and see what that person wants them to see. You look and see what they're hiding. Nina said nothing for a moment. Then she spoke, slowly, one word at a time, as though this was the first time she had ever said it aloud. I've always known when people are lying, since I was very small. Not because they look away or because their voice changes, not the signs people write about in books. I just know, as if their words are one layer, and beneath that layer is another one, and I always see the one underneath first. She paused. And emotions. I can feel what people are really feeling even when they're trying to hide it. People smile, and I know they're afraid. People stay calm, and I know they're angry. I don't know how to explain it. I just know. Walt nodded slowly. The nod of a man hearing confirmed something he had already guessed but needed to hear in her own voice. The person I once knew was the same way, he said. In the old power circles of Chicago, many decades ago, there was a name for people like you. They were called Ash Eyes. Nina looked at him. It's not supernatural, Walt said, as though he had read the question on her face before she could ask it. It's not magic, not mysticism, not anything except science. It's a form of emotional intuition at an extraordinarily sensitive level. An inborn gift. Rare. Very rare. The brains of people like this process emotional signals from others many times faster and more deeply than ordinary people do. They read micro-expressions, breathing patterns, shifts in tone, body language, all at once, at a level the conscious mind can't keep up with, so it rises as instinct, as if you simply know. He was quiet for a moment. These people used to be the highest advisors. In a world where every agreement is built on promises and every promise may be a lie, a person who can see through a lie is the most valuable thing you can possess. They sat in closed meetings and told the man in charge who was telling the truth, who was performing, who was preparing to betray him. What happened to them? Nina asked, because she knew, in the way she always knew, that this story didn't have a happy ending. What always happens to people who know too much truth, Walt said. The powerful families realize that a person who can read the truth doesn't only read the enemy. They read you too. They see every dirty arrangement you hide, every promise you don't keep, every alliance you build on deception. And that's more dangerous than any weapon. He looked out at the lake through the window. They were eliminated, one by one. Not all at once, not loudly. They simply disappeared, little by little, until the name Ash Eyes became something people mentioned only in old stories, like a legend, like something that no longer existed. He turned back to her. But a gene doesn't disappear just because people want it to. It hides. It passes through generations. And once in a very long while, it appears again in a child no one can explain. A child who always knows when adults are lying, who makes every household around her uneasy without anyone understanding why, who grows up feeling as though she sees the world in a kind of light no one else can see. Nina sat very still. She said nothing for a long while. She thought about all the years she had lived without understanding why she was different, why she always knew, why she always saw, why the people around her were uneasy and could never explain the reason. Can you teach me to control it? She asked. That's why I asked you to stay, Walt said. In the weeks that followed, Nina learned, not how to gain a new skill, but how to understand what she had always had. Walt taught her how to tell the difference between her own emotions and the emotions she was reading from other people. Because that was the line which, if left unmarked, would drown her in a sea of feelings that weren't hers while making her believe they were. She learned slowly. She learned well, and through that process, there was one thing she didn't want to admit but couldn't deny. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how many walls she tried to build, the bond between her and Reed was still there. Faint, distant, but there. Like a very low radio frequency, she couldn't switch off, no matter how far she turned the dial. And in the quiet nights by the lake, when she sat alone on the wooden dock watching the water, she felt the thing she didn't want to feel. He was looking for her. While Nina was learning how to understand herself on the shore of Lake Michigan, in Chicago, Reed Kincaid was tearing apart everything he had built over 8 years in order to find her. He began the very night he discovered her room was empty. Jonas was the first person he called, and the order was only 3 words. Find her. Jonas didn't ask who, didn't ask why. He simply nodded and got to work, because that was how Jonas Heath functioned. Receive the order, carry it out, ask no questions whose answers wouldn't change the action. Reed used every resource he had. The family's network stretched across the entire Great Lakes region, from Chicago to Milwaukee to Detroit. Dozens of connections in small towns, at truck stops, in bars along the highway, places ordinary people passed without noticing but where the Kincaid family had eyes and ears everywhere. He called, he gave orders, he waited, and information began to come back. But it was wrong. Not wrong in the sense that no one knew anything. Wrong in the sense that someone was deliberately sending him in the wrong direction. A captain in the Western Territory reported that someone had seen Nina's car outside Milwaukee, heading toward Madison. Reed sent men to Madison. Nothing. Another captain reported that a young woman matching her description had rented a room at a motel near the Indiana border. Reed sent men to Indiana. Nothing. The third lead pointed south, in the exact opposite direction, and when Jonas checked it, the source turned out to be a man connected to a Captain Marshall Pruitt had dined with privately 2 weeks earlier. Reed sat in his study at 3 o'clock in the morning, staring at the map on his desk with red marks across every location already searched, and he understood. Someone inside the family was blocking him. Not by accident, not through incompetence. Deliberately, systematically, and with enough authority to coordinate several captains into reporting false leads at the same time. He knew it was Marshall. He knew in the way you know when you look at a painting and recognize the brushstrokes. You don't need a signature to know who made it. But knowing and proving are two different things. And in this world, accusing the family's highest advisor without hard proof was no different from shooting yourself in the foot. So Reed didn't accuse him. He kept searching. And the manor began to talk. Rumors spread the way rumors always spread in places of power. Fast, distorted, and repeated by people who lacked imagination, so they had to invent simple explanations for things they didn't understand. The boss abandoned his new bride to chase after a cook. The boss had been bewitched. The cook had used her position to get close to power. Small stories were told in hallways, in parking lots, in late-night calls between captains, and each time they were retold, another invented detail was added, while the truth sank farther away beneath layers of lies. Carolyn Davenport, who by the terms of the agreement should by now have been Reed's wife, said nothing publicly. She moved through the manor with the self-possession of someone watching very carefully and speaking very little. And that made Reed respect her, even though he had no time to say so. On the 15th day, Jonas came to Reed's study with information he delivered in a flatter tone than usual. The tone Jonas used when the news was bad enough not to need any extra emotion. Marshall had met privately with the 4 most senior captains over the past week. The contents of those meetings had not been recorded officially, but Jonas had his own sources, and those sources reported that Marshall was proposing something very specific. That Reed Kincaid was no longer stable enough to lead the family, that his decision to abandon everything in pursuit of a cook was proof of lost control, and that the family needed someone to hold temporary authority until Reed recovered. Reed listened. He said nothing for about a minute. A minute is a very long time when you are sitting across from Reed Kincaid waiting for him to react. Jonas stood still and waited, because he knew Reed wasn't silent because he had nothing to say, but because he was deciding. And when Reed decided, everything afterward moved very fast and did not turn back. "I'm handing temporary operational authority to you," Reed said. Jonas looked at him. "Not to any captain," Reed said. "To you. I don't trust anyone else in this family right now, and I won't pretend that I do." It was a decision that broke every order of things. A bodyguard does not take command. That wasn't how any family in history operated, and Reed knew that. And he also knew that this decision would hand Marshall more ammunition, more proof to support the claim that the boss had lost his mind. But Reed knew something else too. Out of the 20 men he had sat at a table with for 8 years, Jonas Heath was the only one who had never wanted his chair. And in this world, that was the closest thing to loyalty a man could find. "Are you sure?" Jonas asked, not with doubt in his voice, with the voice of a man wanting to be certain that the one giving the order had seen every consequence and was still choosing to go forward. Reed looked at Jonas. "If I lose her, what am I keeping the family for?" Jonas said nothing. Then he nodded. One single nod, firm and clean. The nod of a man who didn't need to hear anything else. Reed stood up. He left the manor that night alone, with one car and a new direction that this time had not come from any captain. It came from the owner of a small bar in a lakeside town, the only contact in the network who wasn't under Marshall's influence. A man who remembered a young, dark-haired woman traveling alone, asking for directions into the northern forest. Reed drove north. This time, he didn't send men ahead. This time, he went alone. While Reed was driving north, at Kincaid Manor, Carolyn Davenport was doing something no one expected from a political bride who had just been abandoned. She was thinking. Carolyn's position in the manor at that moment was something no one could clearly define, including Carolyn herself. She wasn't a wife, because the signing ceremony had been an alliance agreement, not an official wedding, and the groom had disappeared from the manor that very night to chase after a cook. She wasn't a guest, because a guest has the right to leave at any time, and Marshall Pruitt had spoken with her privately on the second day after the signing, in a tone that was polite but unmistakable, telling her that her presence in the manor was necessary to maintain the agreement, that this was only a temporary phase, that Reed would return soon, and everything would proceed according to plan. Carolyn listened, nodded, and didn't believe a word of it. She was a daughter of the Davenport family. She had been raised in a world where every sentence carried two meanings, and every smile had a purpose. She knew when someone was managing her instead of speaking to her, and Marshall Pruitt was managing her. But Carolyn didn't leave. Not because she was being forced, because she wanted to understand. Too many things didn't fit. Reed Kincaid wasn't the kind of man who abandoned everything to run after a girl simply because of attraction. She had met enough powerful men in her life to know the difference between a man who was infatuated and a man who was desperate. Reed wasn't infatuated. Reed was desperate. And that desperation had a shape entirely different from the one the rumors in the manor described. She began to ask questions, not directly, because direct questions in an environment like this only bring you prepared answers. She asked in circles, small questions, questions that seemed harmless, to people she recognized as likely to know more than they were saying. Ruth McAllister, the head housekeeper, was the first. Carolyn asked Ruth about the kitchen staff in a light, social tone, and Ruth answered in a shorter voice than usual, with the kind of clipped interruption used by someone protecting another person, without wanting to make clear whom she was protecting. Carolyn took note. She asked a few other staff members about the kitchen schedule, about who usually worked the late shift, and received evasive answers, paired with averted eyes that showed they knew more, and had been told by someone not to speak. Carolyn took note of that too. She assembled the pieces, one small piece at a time, like putting together a picture when all you have is the outer edge and have to guess the center. And the picture that began to emerge looked entirely different from the version her family had been shown before she came to Chicago. One morning, around the 12th day after the signing, Carolyn encountered Jonas Heath in the hallway of the East Wing. Jonas was walking quickly, with the stride of a man who had things to do and no time for polite conversation. Carolyn stopped him with a single sentence, spoken plainly and without detour, because she had already assembled enough pieces to know that detouring with Jonas Heath was a waste of time for both of them. "Marshall knew about the cook before I came here, didn't he?" Jonas looked at her. He didn't look at her the way most of the men in the manor looked at her, meaning they looked at a political bride, at a Davenport daughter, at a position instead of a person. Jonas looked at her the way he looked at everything, with quick, accurate judgment and honesty inside his silence. "That's not something I can confirm or deny," he said. "Then it's true," Carolyn said. Jonas didn't answer. He didn't deny it a second time either. And sometimes, the absence of a denial is the clearest confirmation you can receive. Carolyn turned and went back to her room. She closed the door, sat down in the chair by the window, and she sat there for a very long time, looking out across the manor grounds without truly seeing, because what she was looking at was inside her head, not outside the glass. Marshall knew, before the marriage agreement was proposed, before she flew from the East Coast to Chicago, before she stood in the great black carpeted room and smiled at 20 men she had never met, and nodded toward a life she had been told was an honor. Marshall knew, and he still let her come, still staged all of it, still placed her in the role of political bride to a man who was in love with someone else, not because he didn't care about her, but because whether she mattered or not had never been part of his equation. Carolyn Davenport sat in her room and said nothing. It was the silence of someone who had been patient long enough, had been polite long enough, had played the obedient bride long enough, and had decided that the time for patience was over. On the 21st day, Reed pulled the car over in the last town before the forest along Lake Michigan. The town was so small it had only one gas station, one grocery store, and one bar, whose owner was the man who had given Reed the only trustworthy lead he had received in 3 weeks. Jonas sat in the passenger seat, silent in the way. Jonas was always silent when he knew Reed was about to say something he wasn't going to like. Reed turned off the engine, sat still for a moment, then said, "From here, I go alone." Jonas didn't react at once. He stared through the windshield at the dark tree line ahead, then turned to look at Reed with a flat expression, though his eyes were saying a great deal. "If she sees a convoy of my men coming," Reed said, "she'll keep running. She isn't afraid of me. She's afraid of everything that comes with me. The black cars, the bodyguards, the shadow of the family. She ran from those things, and if I bring them with me, I'm only proving she was right to run." He opened the car door, left his phone on the dashboard, pulled the key from the ignition and placed it in Jonas's hand. "Hold the family for me. If Marshall makes a move, you decide. I trust you." Jonas took the key, looked at it, then watched Reed step out of the car, with no heavy coat, no luggage, nothing except the clothes he was wearing and shoes that had never been designed for walking through a forest. And for the first time in many years, Jonas Heath almost said something outside the boundaries of duty. Almost. But he didn't. He only watched Reed walk into the tree line and disappear, then remained alone in the car with the boss's phone on the dashboard and the feeling that the world had just tilted a few degrees in a direction no one had predicted. Reed walked. The first day wasn't bad. He followed the trail the bar owner had pointed out, heading north along the lake, through alternating stretches of sparse woods and dense forest. He didn't know where to find Nina. He only knew she had gone this way, and of all the things he had right now, that was the only one. On the second day, he lost the trail. The forest thickened. The light grew thinner. His shoes weren't made for the terrain, and began rubbing his heels raw until every step reminded him that he didn't belong in this place. Reed Kincaid, the man before whom 20 captains bowed their heads, the man whose phone call could shake the entire Great Lakes region, was walking alone in the woods with blistered feet and no idea where he was going. And for the first time in 8 years, he wasn't the boss. He wasn't the head of the table. He wasn't the name people feared or wanted to use. He was only a man searching for the woman he had lost, on his own feet, with nothing else. Walt Grayson saw Reed before Reed saw Walt. He had been watching since Reed entered the lake region. 20 years of living in these woods had taught him to recognize every unusual movement, and a man dressed like the city, wandering through deep forest, was unusual by every definition. He didn't approach at once, he observed. He watched the way Reed moved, the way he stopped at every fork, and chose a direction not by map or compass but by something else, by instinct, by feeling, by the way a man moved when he was completely lost and still refused to turn back. He found Reed on the afternoon of the second day, sitting on a fallen tree beside an old trail, motionless, his hands hanging at his sides, his head slightly bowed, his eyes lowered to the ground without truly seeing it. He wasn't crying. Reed Kincaid didn't cry, but there was something worse than crying on his face. Exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of a man who had walked too far, the exhaustion of a man who had carried something too heavy for too many years, and had just set down the last thing that had kept him standing, and now there was nothing left to carry, so his body no longer knew what to do with 2 empty hands. Walt walked over and sat beside the fallen trunk, about an arm's length from Reed. He said nothing. He took a bottle of water from his pack and placed it between them. Reed looked at the bottle, then at Walt, then picked it up and drank. They sat in silence for a long time. The forest moved around them, birdsong, whined through the leaves, water running somewhere in the distance, the sounds of a world that didn't know and didn't care that 2 men were sitting on a fallen tree in the middle of it. At last Walt spoke. "She's at my place." Reed looked up. In his eyes there was something Walt had seen many times in his life, in many different people, and yet it had never lost its weight no matter how many times he had seen it. Hope. The kind of hope carried by a man who had prepared himself for the worst and was suddenly told the worst had not happened. "But you don't get to see her today," Walt said. Reed opened his mouth. Walt raised a hand. "You need a bath. You need food. And you need to sit down and write out everything you want to say to her. Write it, by hand, on paper." "I can say it to her directly," Reed said. "No," Walt said, calm but firm in the way of a man who wasn't arguing but stating a fact. "You can't, because when you stand in front of her, you'll say the wrong thing. Powerful men always say the wrong thing when they're afraid. They're used to giving orders, used to controlling things, used to arranging the world to suit themselves. And when they stand before the person they can't order, can't control, and can't arrange, they panic, and they say the wrong thing. Write it down. Write until every sentence is true. Then I'll give it to her. Walt brought Reed back to the house, fed him, let him wash, let him rest. Then he placed a stack of blank paper and a pen in front of him, and stepped out onto the porch to sit with his tea, leaving him alone with the small room and the yellow light and the thing Reed feared most in the world, the truth he would have to write out in his own hand. Reed wrote through the night. He wrote the first version, read it back, and tore it up. Wrote the second, read it back, tore that up too. The third was longer, closer to what he wanted to say, but something was still missing. Something still sounded more like an explanation than the truth, and he tore that one up as well. The fourth, he wrote near dawn, when his eyes were blurred and his hand was aching and he no longer had enough strength left to arrange the words beautifully. And that was exactly when the letter became real, because the truth usually only appears when you're too tired to keep pretending. The letter was written on white paper with a black ballpoint pen, the handwriting slanting to the right, in the way of a right-handed person writing quickly, the strokes clear in the first lines, and then growing smaller and closer together toward the end, as though the writer were afraid of running out of paper, or running out of courage before finishing. There was no date, no opening greeting, only her name, Nina. He didn't begin with an apology. He began with the truth. I won't apologize first, not because I don't regret what happened, but because you deserve to hear the truth before anything else, and I want to give you what you deserve instead of what is easier to say. 6 weeks before the signing, Marshal Pruitt came to my study. He knew about us. He gave me a list of captains, and said that if I didn't agree to the marriage alliance with the Davenport family, he would bring you before the council with the accusation that you used your position to gain access to power. I looked at that list and saw names with enough weight to turn a threat into reality. He gave me 3 days. I agreed. I agreed because I believed it was the only way to keep you safe. I agreed because I had trusted Marshall for 8 years, and I didn't realize in time that that trust had become a trap. I agreed, and I didn't tell you. That's something I have to live with. I made a decision alone that should have been ours. I chose to keep you in the dark and called it protection, when in truth it was fear. I was afraid that if I told you the truth, you would stay and fight. And I was afraid that fight would crush you, because you have no family, no shield, nothing except yourself. I was wrong. Not wrong because the outcome was bad. Wrong because I looked at you, the person I know better than anyone in this world, and still didn't believe you were strong enough to face the truth with me. That is the greatest disrespect I have ever shown you, and I know it. Now comes the part I need you to read slowly. The message you received that morning, the one telling you to leave the manor before the evening, I didn't send it. I didn't write it. I didn't know it existed until I went back to your room and found it empty. Tessa Pruitt, Marshall's daughter, sent it from my phone. He arranged it. He knew that if you believed I told you to go, you would go, because you trust me. And he used that trust to push you out of my life before I realized what he had done. You left because you thought I chose convenience over you. You thought I looked at you and saw a problem that needed to be solved before the party. I need you to know that isn't the truth. It has never been the truth. Not for a single second in 14 months have I looked at you and seen anything other than the person I wanted to sit beside at 3 a.m. in a kitchen that smelled like food, instead of the world I have to live in, every day. I've been searching for you for 23 days. I've lost your trail, been sent in the wrong direction, been blocked by my own people. I nearly lost the family because Marshall used my absence to push for my removal. I gave operational authority to Jonas, because he's the only one I still trust. And I drove alone to this forest and left the car, left the phone, left everything, because I understand that if you see me arrive with men and power, you'll keep running, because you aren't afraid of me. You're afraid of the shadow I carry. I'm outside Walt's house. I'll wait here. If you want me to leave, I'll leave. If you want me to stay, I'll stay. I won't knock. I won't force this. I've made enough decisions for you. This time, the choice is yours. One more thing. I've spent all this time thinking about how to end this letter. A promise. A vow. Something large enough to make you believe this time will be different. But I don't have any promises I haven't already broken. So I'll give you a small truth instead of a large promise. You once asked me why I came down to the kitchen that first night. The night Jonas asked you to bring food to my room. I told you it was because I was tired. That was the only time I ever lied to you. I came down because I heard you singing while you were washing dishes. I didn't know the song. I didn't know the words. I only knew it was the first time in 8 years I had heard a sound in that manner that carried no calculation at all. No one trying to impress. No one performing. Just a person singing softly because she thought no one was listening. I wanted to sit near that sound. That's all. Read. Walt gave the letter to Nina in the morning, when the light through the window was still pale gray, and the lake outside was so still it looked like glass. He didn't say anything. He only placed the paper, folded into quarters, on the table in front of her, then took his cup of tea and stepped out onto the porch, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone with the small room and the letter. Nina looked at the paper. She didn't pick it up at once. She sat there looking at it for a long time, as though that paper were a door, and she was deciding whether she wanted to know what was on the other side of it. Because once you read, you can't unread. Once you know, you can't go back to not knowing. And Nina, who had spent her entire life building walls between herself and the things capable of hurting her, understood very well that this letter, whatever it said, would break one of those walls. She picked it up, opened it. Read. The first time she read quickly, her eyes running over each line as though searching for one specific word, one specific sentence, something that would tell her at once whether this was real or just another careful kind of explanation, the kind she had grown used to receiving from men who wanted something from her. She folded the letter shut, sat still, then opened it and read it a second time, this time more slowly, sentence by sentence. She read the part about Marshall and saw the pieces she had felt but had never fully seen. She had known Marshall disliked her, known it in the way she always knew things, through the layer of feeling beneath words, but she hadn't known the extent of it. She hadn't known he had built an entire trap around Reed, using Reed's own fear of losing her. She read the part about the message, and her breathing stopped for half a second. The message hadn't come from Reed. That line she had read over and over again that morning, the line that had confirmed every fear she had carried all her life, the line she had believed was the final proof that she wasn't meant to stay, hadn't been his. Tessa Pruitt. Reed's phone number. A message designed with perfect precision to strike the oldest wound inside her and make her run. And it had worked. She folded the letter again, opened it, read it a third time. This time she read to the end, and stopped there. You once asked me why I came down to the kitchen that first night. Nina read that part and everything around her became very quiet. Not the quiet of the room, the quiet inside her. The kind of quiet that happens when something touches a place so deep that sound can't reach it. She sang very softly when she washed dishes, almost under her breath. She had done it since childhood, in the kitchens of the families she had lived with, in the late nights when she washed dishes alone and believed no one was listening. It wasn't a secret. It was simply something too private, too small, too entirely hers for anyone ever to notice. No one in 21 years of her life had ever mentioned it, because no one had ever heard it. And Reed had heard, from the very first night. He had heard her singing through the kitchen door, and he had said nothing. Not that night. Not on any of the nights that followed. For 14 months, he had known, and he had kept it to himself, as though that singing were something too fragile to bring into the light. And he had been afraid that if he spoke of it, she would stop singing. Nina didn't need the Ash Eyes gift to know this letter was real. She didn't need to read beneath emotion, didn't need to analyze, didn't need any of the things Walt had taught her in the past weeks, because no one could invent that detail. Not Marshall, who knew everything about the family but didn't know she sang while washing dishes. Not Tessa, who knew Reed's phone number but didn't know Nina existed beyond the role of cook. Only Reed. Only the man who had sat in the darkness on the other side of the kitchen door at 1 o'clock in the morning and listened to a small sound the whole world had missed. Nina folded the letter again. She stood up. She walked to the door, and she stopped. She stood just behind the wooden door, not yet opening it, her right hand lifting and resting against the surface of the wood. Her palm lay there lightly, as though she were touching something alive. On the other side of that door, Reed was standing. He had been standing there since morning, exactly where he had said he would be in the letter, not knocking, not calling, not pressing, and his left hand was resting against the outer side of the door, the same place, the same height. Their hands were separated by 3 inches of oak, and neither of them knew the other had placed a hand in the exact same spot, but both of them had. Nina opened the door. When the door opened, Nina saw Reed, and the first thing she thought was that he looked terrible. Truly terrible. Dark circles under his eyes, stubble grown in unevenly, hair stuck to his forehead, clothes wrinkled like a man who had worn them for days without once thinking of changing. He looked like everything Reed Kincaid would never allow himself to look like in front of anyone. And because of that, he looked more real than he ever had in any moment she had seen him before. Nina didn't say anything in the doorway. She looked at him for about 3 seconds, then turned and walked toward the lake. No invitation, no explanation. She simply went and left it to him to decide whether he would follow. He followed. The old dock sat behind Walt's house, stretching out over the lake for about 5 yards, the boards weathered gray with age. Early morning, the water lay flat as a sheet of pale gray glass. Nina sat down on the edge of the dock, her legs hanging above the surface. Reed sat down beside her, leaving enough space that she wouldn't feel crowded, close enough that she would know he was there. They sat in silence for a long time. The sound of the lake, the sound of birds beginning the morning, the light touch of wind moving across the water. Then Nina spoke, her eyes still on the lake, not on him. I read that message at 7:15 in the morning. I was in the kitchen. My hands were still covered in flour. I had to wipe them on my apron before I could pick up the phone. She paused. It'll be easier for both of us. That's what I read, and I thought, so that's it. 14 months. All those nights. All those times you sat in that kitchen and told me things I thought you'd never told anyone. All of it folded down into one line in a text at 7 in the morning. Not even a call. Not even looking me in the eye and saying it. She turned to look at him. I didn't think you chose Carolyn. I knew it was politics. I understand how your world works. But I thought you looked at me and decided the simplest thing was for me to disappear before everything got complicated. I thought you looked at me and saw a mess that needed to be cleared away before evening. Reed said nothing. He listened. He listened in the way he had learned over 8 years at the head of the table. But this time not for strategy. Not because he was measuring the room, but because what she was saying hurt enough that any word from him now would be the wrong one. And the worst part, Nina said, her voice lower now, slower, wasn't that I thought you'd chosen someone else. The worst part was that I thought you looked at me and saw exactly what everyone else always has. A girl who belongs nowhere. A girl who moves through other people's lives without leaving a mark deep enough for anyone to want to keep. Silence. The lake reflected the gray sky without adding any color of its own. Reed spoke slowly, his voice low. Not the boss's voice. Not the voice of a man used to controlling boardrooms, but the voice of a man trying to say the right thing and knowing that if he said the wrong one now, everything would be lost. I didn't send that message, and I've never looked at you and seen a problem. I looked at you and saw the only person in 8 years who made me want to become better than the man that Chair requires me to be. He stopped. But I was wrong, and you deserve to know exactly where I was wrong, he told her, not by repeating what the letter had already said, because she had read it, but by telling her the things the letter couldn't hold fully enough. He told her about the 23 days, about the false leads Marshall had arranged, and how every false lead meant another day of not knowing where she was, whether she was safe, whether she was still alive. He told her about the 15th night, when Jonas had reported that Marshall was pushing to remove him, and he had been forced to choose between going back to hold the family together or continuing to search for her. He told her that he had given authority to Jonas and kept driving, because when he looked at the question, keep the family or find you, the answer had been so clear it hadn't required thought. He told her about the day he left the car and the phone behind in the last town, because he understood that she feared the shadow he carried, not the man himself. Nina listened. She listened in the way she always had, completely, without interrupting, without surface reaction, simply receiving and sorting everything underneath. Why didn't you tell me from the beginning? She asked. About Marshall, about the ultimatum, about all of it. Reed was silent for a very long time. The lake before him was wide and still, and he looked at it as though the answer might be somewhere under the surface. Because I thought silence would protect you, he said at last. I've spent my whole life in a world where keeping secrets is how you keep people alive. The less someone knows, the safer they are. That's the rule I've been breathing for 8 years, and I applied it to you without stopping to think that you aren't a captain. You aren't an enemy. You aren't someone who needs to be managed. You're the woman I love, and you didn't need to be protected by darkness. You needed the truth. I forgot that. And I paid for it with 23 days of not knowing where you were." Nina looked out over the lake. He watched her looking out over the lake. Morning had grown brighter. The pale gray along the horizon was slowly warming toward gold. "I'm sorry," Reed said. "Not the kind of sorry meant to make you forgive me quickly. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know that I understand where I failed, and the kind of apology I'm offering is the kind I'll have to prove with every day I have left, not with what I say today." Nina didn't answer right away. She sat on the old dock, her legs hanging above the water, her eyes on Lake Michigan in the morning as the light slowly changed from gray to pale gold. And she didn't forgive him. Not yet. But she didn't stand up and walk away either. She sat there beside him on the dock, and let the truth they had both spoken lie between them on the old boards, uncovered, unarranged, simply there. And for this moment, that was enough. 3 days after that morning on the dock, Reed and Nina returned to Kincaid Manor. Not through the back door, not at midnight, through the main gate, in broad daylight, when the morning sun was falling straight over the stone road leading into the grounds and everyone in the manor could see. Jonas was waiting at the gate. He gave a single nod when he saw Reed, the short nod of a man who had finished the task of keeping everything standing and was now ready to return authority to the one meant to hold it. Ruth McAllister stood on the front steps. Nina saw Ruth before Ruth saw her, because Ruth was looking toward the gate with the look of someone who had looked that way every day for 3 weeks, every morning and every evening, waiting for something she feared might never come back. Then Ruth saw Nina. She went completely still. Entirely still. Her right hand gripped the doorframe, her knuckles gone white. Her face held no expression, not because she felt nothing, but because she was feeling too much for her face to know what to do with it. Nina crossed the yard, followed the stone path, climbed the steps, stood in front of Ruth. Ruth opened her mouth. No sound came out. She closed it, opened it again, and one single sentence, her voice breaking on the second word, spoken with everything that 23 days of waiting had laid on her shoulders. "I thought you were dead." Then Ruth pulled Nina into her arms. It was the way older people hug, not letting go. Both arms tightened hard around Nina's shoulders as though she were afraid that if she loosened her grip, Nina would disappear again. Ruth's shoulders were shaking. She said nothing else. She didn't need to. Nina stood inside that embrace and let herself be held, and for the first time in a very long while, she felt the thing she had spent her whole life searching for, without knowing that was what she was searching for. The feeling of someone being afraid to lose her. Reed watched the two of them from behind. He didn't say anything, but the way he looked at them, the way his shoulders lowered a little, the way his eyes softened when he saw Nina in Ruth's arms, said more than any words he could have spoken. An hour later, the manor's large meeting room. 15 captains sat around the long oak table. The same table where 3 weeks earlier they had raised glasses to the Davenport Agreement. The air was completely different now. No wine, no smiles, only the strained waiting of men who knew that what was about to happen would shift the balance of power, and each of them was calculating where he ought to stand. Reed stood at the head of the table. He didn't sit. When Reed Kincaid stood while everyone else sat, that was a sign everyone who had spent enough time in the family understood. This wasn't a meeting. This was a judgment. "Marshal Pruitt," Reed said, his voice even, low, and precise as a paper knife. 6 weeks before the signing, he came to my room with a list of captains he claimed were prepared to support an accusation against a member of the manor staff. That list was staged. The number was inflated. The ultimatum was designed to force me into one decision only. He paused, looked around the table. On the morning of the signing, a message was sent from my phone number to the person Marshall wanted removed. I didn't send that message. Tessa Pruitt sent it, under her father's instruction, and in the 23 days that followed, while I searched for the person that message had driven away, Marshal Pruitt directed at least 3 captains to provide false information to obstruct me, while also approaching senior captains to propose removing me from leadership. The room stayed silent. Marshal Pruitt sat on the eastern side of the table, between 2 captains whose loyalty he had spent years carefully building. His face didn't change. Reed continued, his voice still flat, and finally, evidence gathered by Jonas Heath during my absence shows that Marshal Pruitt shared internal family information with outside parties in order to protect his personal position in the event that I was removed. The 2 captains, beside Marshal, looked at each other, then at Marshal. Then, slowly, Like two boats drifting away from a dock, they shifted the slightest bit toward the opposite side. They didn't stand. They didn't make declarations. They only leaned. But in this room, a lean was enough. Marshall's faction broke apart not with an explosion, but with the sound of chairs moving a fraction of an inch. But Marshall Pruitt wasn't a man who surrendered in silence. He had lived 61 years in this world, and 28 years inside this family, and he had not built his career by bowing his head when cornered. He had built it by always holding one final card. "You think I was afraid of that girl because she was a cook with no family standing?" Marshall said, his voice so calm it was cold, his eyes fixed directly on Reed. "I was afraid because she's exactly like your mother." The meeting room, which had already been silent, now went dead still. The kind of silence you feel through your skin instead of your ears. "Your mother had that ability too," Marshall said, each word slow and heavy, like stones set down one by one on the table. "The ability to read people, to see through words, to know who was lying before they'd even finished the sentence. Your father knew. Your father used that ability for 20 years. Every meeting, every agreement, every alliance. She sat beside your father and told him who was pretending and who was real. She was his most valuable weapon." Marshall stopped. And when he spoke again, his voice changed, only slightly, but enough for Nina, who was standing at the back of the room, to feel what she had learned to read in the weeks by the lake. Not anger, not ambition, but regret. When your mother wanted a life of her own, your father refused to accept it. She stayed in this manner, and little by little lost the will to live, day by day, month by month, until she faded in silence, and no one, not even your father, understood in time that she had been exhausted long before that. Marshall looked at Reed. "I saw it happen. I stood in this manner and watched it happen, and did nothing. And when I saw that girl, saw the way she looked, saw the way you looked at her, I knew what would happen. You would do exactly what your father did. You would keep her. You would use her. And you wouldn't let go until she broke. I drove her away because I didn't want to watch it happen again." The room stayed silent. 15 captains sat motionless. Reed stood at the head of the table, and his face, the face no one in that room had seen lose control in 8 years, was now being held still with everything he had. From the back of the room, Walt Grayson, who had returned to the manor with Reed and Nina, and had stood in silence at the corner throughout the meeting as though he were only a shadow, nodded once. One single nod. And everyone who saw it understood that Marshall Pruitt, however complicated his reasons might have been, had not lied about this. Nina stepped out from the back of the meeting room. She walked between the 2 rows of chairs where the 15 captains sat motionless, through the eyes turned toward her with every kind of expression, all of which she could read, and none of which she cared about at this moment. She went straight to Marshall Pruitt. He had been watching her from the moment she began to move, with the eyes of a man prepared for several different reactions, but not entirely certain which one would come. Nina stopped in front of him. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She spoke in a voice that was level and clear, each word laid down the way someone places stones onto a scale. "You were afraid because you saw his mother in me," she said. "I understand that. You watched a woman like me get kept in this manner until there was nothing left of her. And you didn't want to watch that happen again." She paused. Marshall looked at her, and on his face, for the first time since the meeting began, there was something other than control. Something like waiting, the kind of waiting of a man who knows the next blow is coming and knows he deserves to take it. "But you forgot one thing," Nina said. "His mother was never given a choice. No one asked whether she wanted to stay or wanted to go. No one put the truth in front of her and said, 'This is what is happening. Now choose.'" She looked directly into his eyes. "You didn't give me a choice either. You decided for me. You decided I would be crushed, so you pushed me away before I had the chance to prove you wrong. You did exactly the thing you said you were trying to stop. You and his father are more alike than you think." Marshall Pruitt said nothing. He sat in silence, and that silence wasn't the silence of a man preparing a rebuttal. It was the silence of a man who had just heard a sentence he couldn't deny, couldn't bend, couldn't turn aside with any argument or strategy he had used for 28 years. Because she was right, and he knew it. Reed spoke. His voice returned now to that cold, controlled calm that belonged only to him. The kind of calm everyone in the room knew was the most dangerous kind. "Marshall Pruitt leaves the manor before tomorrow morning. He holds no position in this family from this moment forward. Marshall nodded. One single nod, slow, from a man who had fought his last fight and lost, and was old enough to know that when you lose, you stand up and walk away. You don't stay lying on the floor. Tessa Pruitt, Reed continued, acted under her father's direction. She is 24 years old. She will remain in the manor and work at the lowest level, under supervision, not as punishment, as a chance to understand what this world looks like from the point of view of someone without power. If she learns that, she'll become better than her father. If she doesn't, that's her choice. Tessa Pruitt, seated in the back row, pale as paper, nodded without looking at anyone. That afternoon, Reed called Carolyn's father. Mr. Davenport listened to everything Reed said without interrupting, with the cold patience of a man who had built a family by knowing when to listen and when to speak. When Reed finished, Mr. Davenport was silent for 3 seconds, then said, "My daughter isn't a chess piece, Reed. If you'd treated her properly from the beginning, we wouldn't need this call." "You're right," Reed said, "and I owe her an apology in person, not over the phone." Silence. Then Mr. Davenport said, "Good, that's enough." Carolyn sought out Nina that evening, when Nina was sitting in the small room Ruth had prepared for her, not the old room in the staff quarters, but a room on the second floor, a room for someone who stayed, not someone who served. Carolyn stood in the doorway with her back straight, and the clear gaze of someone who had prepared carefully for this conversation, and wouldn't allow herself to misspeak by even one word. "I didn't know about the relationship between the two of you," Carolyn said, "but I'm a daughter of the Davenport family. I've been taught how to read a boardroom since I was 15 years old. I know how to ask questions. And I didn't ask. I was pleased to be the bride without checking whether the ticket was real. That wasn't innocence." Nina looked at her, looked long enough to read, and what she read wasn't falseness, wasn't calculation, but the hard honesty of someone saying something they didn't enjoy saying but knew had to be said. "Sit down," Nina said. "There's coffee if you want some." Carolyn sat. They talked. Not long, not easy, not comfortable, but honest. And when Carolyn stood to leave about 40 minutes later, they weren't friends, but they were two people who had looked each other in the eye and spoken the truth. And in this world, sometimes that was rarer and more valuable than friendship. Earlier, when Reed had stood at the head of the meeting table and declared, in a voice clear and needing no one's approval, that Nina Blake would remain beside him, not because of family standing, not because of politics, but because she was the woman he chose and he would not explain that choice to anyone in the room, there had been a silence that lasted about 4 seconds. Then, from the far end of the table, where Jonas Heath stood leaning against the wall with his arms folded as he always stood through every meeting, the least talkative man in Kincaid Manor dropped his arms and began to clap. Not the kind of applause that is polite, light, and formal. Real applause. Firm. Steady. The applause of a man who had waited a very long time to hear exactly what he had just heard. A few captains looked at Jonas in surprise, because in 8 years they had never heard Jonas Heath make any sound louder than a short sentence. Then one more person began to clap. Then another. Then Ruth McAllister, standing in the doorway of the meeting room, began to cry openly and did not care in the least who saw. 8 months after the night in the meeting room, Kincaid Manor was still Kincaid Manor. The same walls, the same stone path, the same large kitchen on the first floor, where the smell of food was still the first thing you noticed when you stepped inside. But what lived within it had changed. Reed didn't appoint a single advisor to replace Marshall. He built a new council, smaller, made up of 5 people, chosen not for bloodline or years of service, but for one criterion only, whether they were willing to tell him the truth when he was wrong. Walt Grayson agreed to join under one condition, which he stated plainly in their first meeting. "I'll tell you when you're wrong. You won't like it. But you'll listen. If not, I'll go back to the lake." Reed nodded. "I'll be counting the days," Walt said, and he stayed. Ruth McAllister was officially appointed manor manager, a position she had in practice held for years but had never been recognized with ink on paper. When Jonas read the appointment aloud to her, Ruth stood in the middle of the kitchen, still holding a dishcloth, and cried, openly, without hiding, with the complete indifference of someone who no longer cared what anyone thought about her crying. The young trainee beside her looked startled, but Nina only smiled and kept kneading dough, because she was used to Ruth crying at important moments and knew it was how Ruth loved, loudly, clearly, and without asking permission. Carolyn Davenport left the manor 3 weeks after the meeting, returning to the East Coast, back to her family. She didn't leave in anger. She left with the clarity of someone who had seen the truth and chosen to walk her own path. Before she went, she stopped at the kitchen door and said to Nina, "If he does something stupid again, call me. I know how to deal with powerful men who think they're always right." Nina almost smiled. Almost. Tessa Pruitt stayed at the manor. She worked at the lowest level, cleaning rooms, sorting laundry, the kind of work she had never imagined doing when she was the daughter of the chief advisor. She didn't complain. She didn't speak much to anyone. She simply worked, day after day, with the expression of someone working through something inside that needed time to finish. A few months later, Nina received a message from Tessa's number. Not an apology, just an address. A small cafe on the outskirts of Chicago that Nina had once mentioned in the kitchen, in passing, in a conversation she hadn't thought anyone was paying attention to. Tessa had remembered. Nina didn't reply, but she didn't delete it either. She kept it. And sometimes, when she scrolled through her messages, she would pause on it for a second, then move on, with a small nod in her mind that no one else could see. One late afternoon, 8 months and a few days after the signing night, Nina was in the kitchen, alone. The window was open. The late light poured in, that thick golden light of summer nearing its end, the kind you only see around 6 in the evening when the sun is low but not yet gone. She was preparing dinner. Her hands moved through the ingredients from memory, without needing to look, without needing to think, the way someone does a thing she has done 1,000 times before. And she sang, very softly, almost under her breath, the song she always sang when she thought she was completely alone, a song without a name, without fixed words, just a melody she had carried since childhood, from the kitchens of houses she had never stayed in long enough to call home. She sang because the kitchen was empty, because the window was open, because for the first time in her life, she was standing in a kitchen where she knew she would still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. She turned to reach for salt on the shelf behind her, and she saw Reed. He stood leaning against the kitchen doorway, arms folded, silent. She didn't know how long he had been there. His eyes were on her with an expression she had learned to read over the past 8 months. Not the expression of a boss, not the expression of the head of a family, but the expression of a man listening to the one sound he wanted more than any other in the world. Nina stopped singing. "Don't stop," Reed said. Nina looked at him. "How long have you been listening?" "Since the first night," Reed said. "I never stopped." Nina said nothing. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she turned back, continued cutting vegetables, and began to sing again. Not softer, not louder, just singing, in the way she had always sung. But this time she knew someone was listening, and she didn't hide. Reed stayed where he was. The late light fell through the kitchen window, laying a pale gold over both of them. And the kitchen held the smell of food cooking, and there was a very soft song, and the quiet of someone listening, and no one asked whether she was happy, because the answer was already there in the song she no longer hid. If this story touched you, please press like and share so more people can hear it. Tell us how you feel about Nina and Reed's story in the comments so we can hear what is in your heart. Because every comment you leave is the greatest motivation for us to keep telling new stories every day. If you want to follow more stories, please subscribe to our channel, because the best stories always need someone who stays until the end. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.